5 starting offensive linemen, gone just like that. In a league built on continuity and protection, the Cleveland Browns hit reset in a way almost no franchise ever does. The question isn't just why, it's what they were trying to fix and who they were really trying to protect. NFL teams don't just wake up one morning and replace an entire offensive line. Continuity up front is everything. Chemistry between linemen takes years to build, timing on double teams, protection calls at the line, silent communication in hostile stadiums. That's why what the Cleveland Browns did raised immediate eyebrows around the league. 5 starters all reset. That kind of overhaul isn't a tweak, it's a statement. Offensive line units are usually adjusted piece by piece. A struggling guard might be replaced, a veteran tackle might be upgraded, but wiping the board clean, that suggests something deeper than normal performance concerns. It signals organizational dissatisfaction at a structural level. And the timing made it even louder. The move came amid growing debates about the development of Shedeur Sanders. Pressure rates had been discussed publicly. Pocket collapses were showing up on film. Analysts questioned whether the protection schemes were holding up or if the quarterback was holding the ball too long. But inside league circles, some observers quietly pointed to something else. Some insiders claim the protection breakdowns looked unusually consistent. Not just physical losses at the line of scrimmage, but missed assignments, delayed pickups, free rushers coming untouched. Those are the kinds of errors that don't just hurt drives, they damage confidence. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence of intentional underperformance. The NFL is too competitive for that kind of accusation to be thrown around lightly. But what raised suspicion among fans wasn't just that the line struggled. It was how the struggles showed up at key moments in high-leverage situations repeatedly. When a franchise responds by replacing every starter, it tells you the internal evaluation was harsh. Coaches preach accountability, front offices preach competition, and when 5 positions change at once, it suggests leadership believed the problem wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Whether that was communication, effort, scheme fit, or simply a group that wasn't meshing, the organization clearly decided incremental fixes wouldn't be enough. Because rebuilding an offensive line isn't cheap, it requires draft capital, cap space, and trust in scouting evaluations. You don't take that risk unless you believe protecting your quarterback is the priority above everything else. And that's where the conversation shifts. If the issue was simply talent, this is a football correction. But if the reset was about restoring confidence, reshaping culture, or sending a message inside the locker room, then this wasn't just a personnel move. It was a declaration. And what the tape reveals next only deepens the debate. When you slow the tape down, the story gets more complicated. On the surface, the numbers didn't look catastrophic. A few stalled drives, some sacks, a handful of third-and-long situations that never fully developed. To casual viewers, it felt like typical rookie turbulence for Shedeur Sanders. But the film shows context the box score never captures. There were snaps where edge rushers came free almost instantly, guards turning the wrong way on twists, delayed recognition against simple pressure looks. And while missed assignments happen on every team, what stood out to many observers was the pattern. Similar breakdowns, similar timing, often in critical downs. Now, that doesn't automatically mean anything intentional occurred. Offensive line play is built on communication, and young units can unravel quickly under pressure. But consistency matters. When the same types of errors repeat, analysts start asking whether it's chemistry, scheme confusion, or something deeper. Meanwhile, Sanders' role in those moments deserves equal examination. Instead of panicking, he often stepped up into collapsing pockets. He slid laterally, kept his eyes downfield, and delivered throws under duress. Some of the completions came with defenders already closing in. Those aren't stat-padding throws, those are survival reps. Critics initially argued he held the ball too long, that he needed to speed up his internal clock. And in fairness, every young quarterback adjusts to NFL timing. But when protection breaks down in under 2 seconds, the internal clock barely matters. That's where the debate shifted. Pressure rate statistics started circulating among fans online. Independent film breakdowns highlighted how often rushers arrived untouched. Social media clips compared clean pockets from other teams to the chaos Sanders navigated. It became less about isolated mistakes and more about structural instability. Still, not everyone agreed. Some analysts maintained the offensive scheme asked linemen to hold blocks longer for deeper root concepts. Others pointed out that protection calls begin with the quarterback, meaning miscommunication isn't always one-sided. That nuance often gets lost in viral conversations. But here, what the tape undeniably shows, Sanders didn't look overwhelmed. Even when the pocket folded, his mechanics remained composed. His footwork reset quickly. His eyes didn't drop to the rush immediately. Those traits matter. They suggest a quarterback adjusting rather than unraveling. And when 5 starters are later replaced, the film gets reinterpreted. Plays once blamed on quarterback hesitation start looking like breakdowns up front. Sacks that felt like indecision begin to resemble protection failure. The same footage, different lens. That's why this section of the story matters so much. Because the film doesn't scream sabotage, it doesn't confirm conspiracy, but it does raise legitimate football questions about cohesion, communication, and whether the protection unit was functioning at an NFL standard. And once leadership saw that same tape internally, the response was swift. That's when the conversation quietly shifted. Power inside an NFL building is never as simple as it looks on Sundays. When fans watch from the outside, they see headsets, laminated play sheets, and sideline conversations. What they don't see are the layers of influence behind every decision, especially when it comes to a young quarterback like Shedeur Sanders. That's where the coaching power dynamics become impossible to ignore. In most organizations, the head coach sets the tone, but the offensive coordinator controls the system. The quarterback coach shapes mechanics and confidence. The front office evaluates long-term viability, and ownership, they watch everything. If the offense struggles, blame rarely lands in just one place, it spreads. When protection issues and play-calling inconsistencies surfaced, questions naturally shifted toward leadership. Was the scheme putting Sanders in high-risk, long-developing concepts? Were adjustments being made quickly enough when defenses dialed up pressure? And perhaps most importantly, were all voices aligned? That's the part fans don't see. A coordinator might believe in aggressive downfield concepts. A head coach might prefer ball control. A quarterback coach might want quicker reads installed to protect a young passer. When philosophies collide, execution suffers. And young quarterbacks often absorb the fallout. If protection breaks down repeatedly and the scheme doesn't adjust, it raises the question. Is the staff adapting to the player, or is the player being forced into a rigid system? In Sanders' case, the tape suggested flashes of adaptability from him, quicker checkdowns, more pre-snap adjustments, even subtle protection calls. That implies he was evolving. The bigger question was whether the structure around him evolved just as quickly. Power dynamics also influence accountability. When 5 offensive line changes happen in a short window, that's not random. That signals internal evaluation at a high level. Either the coaching staff pushed for personnel adjustments or leadership above them intervened. Either way, someone made a statement, "This is not acceptable." And that statement carries weight. Because in the NFL, replacing that many starters isn't cosmetic, it's strategic. It signals urgency. It also signals belief that the quarterback is worth protecting. But shifts like that can create tension. Veteran players lose roles. Position coaches feel scrutiny. Coordinators face quiet pressure to justify their system. And when the quarterback continues to show composure despite chaos, the internal narrative begins to tilt in his favor. That's how power subtly shifts. Not through public declarations, not through press conference drama, but through personnel moves, schematic tweaks, and who the organization chooses to protect, literally and figuratively. In the end, coaching power dynamics aren't about ego, they're about direction. And when a franchise adjusts the structure around a young quarterback instead of replacing him, that tells you everything about where the real confidence lies. Power shifts in the NFL rarely happen with announcements. They happen with adjustments, quietly, strategically, and sometimes decisively. That's exactly what made Todd Monken's reset move so important. After weeks of inconsistency and visible offensive tension, the pressure wasn't just on the players, it was on the play caller. The scheme had been aggressive, vertical, and timing-based. When it worked, it looked explosive. When protection failed or communication broke down, it looked chaotic. And chaos around a young quarterback is dangerous. That's where Monken's shift became noticeable. Instead of stubbornly doubling down on deep developing concepts, the offense began incorporating quicker reads, layered route combinations, and more rhythm-based throws. The ball came out faster. Protection assignments were simplified. Motion packages were used not just for deception, but for clarity. That wasn't random. That was recalibration. Offensive coordinators in the NFL face a critical choice when adversity hits: force players to execute the system better or reshape the system to better serve the players. Monken chose the latter. And that choice spoke volumes. By leaning into quicker timing concepts, he reduced exposure to pressure. By incorporating more intermediate crossing routes and high percentage throws, he stabilized drives. And by allowing the quarterback more pre-snap autonomy, he quietly signaled trust. Trust changes everything. Because when a coordinator adjusts rather than blames, it shifts locker room energy. It tells the offensive line, "We're helping you." It tells receivers, "Be sharper in space." And it tells the quarterback, "We're building this with you, not around you." The reset also wasn't just schematic, it was philosophical. Early gameplay scripts became more balanced. Situational play calling became less predictable. There was a visible emphasis on keeping the offense on schedule, fewer low-percentage shots on early downs, more manageable third and shorts. That's maturity in play calling. It's easy for a coordinator to chase explosive plays. It's harder to swallow pride and focus on efficiency. Monken's reset suggested awareness that development sometimes requires restraint. And that matters in the long term. Young quarterbacks don't just need highlight throws, they need rhythm, they need confidence built through completions, they need to feel the game slow down. The adjusted structure allowed that. You could see it in pocket movement, in quicker decisions, in fewer forced throws into tight coverage. The offense wasn't perfect, but it was controlled, and control is the foundation of growth. Perhaps the most telling part of the reset wasn't what changed, it was what didn't. The core identity remained aggressive. The vertical concepts were still there, but they were layered within a smarter framework. Instead of living on high-risk plays, the offense built toward them. That's evolution. In the NFL, stubborn coordinators lose locker rooms. Adaptive coordinators gain influence. By resetting instead of resisting, Monken didn't just stabilize the offense, he reinforced his leadership. Because sometimes the most powerful move a coach can make isn't drawing up something new. It's admitting something needs to change and having the confidence to change it. If you really want to understand the reset, you have to look at the wide receivers. Because this wasn't just about protection or quarterback timing. It was about spacing, leverage, and trust on the outside, and that's where Todd Monken made one of his smartest adjustments. Early on, the receiver routes were heavy on deep stems and longer developing concepts: vertical clears, deep outs, layered posts. On paper, it stretched defenses. In reality, it also stretched protection. When timing got disrupted, receivers were arriving at landmarks late, and the quarterback was forced to either hold the ball or throw into tight coverage. That's a losing formula. So the shift began with route structure. Instead of asking receivers to win 20 yards downfield every snap, Monken layered in more quick game concepts: slants, option routes, shallow drags, spacing concepts against zone. The emphasis moved from explosive isolation to controlled separation. And that subtle difference changed everything. Now receivers weren't just running routes, they were reading coverage with the quarterback. If a defender leveraged inside, the route bent outward. If zone windows opened early, receivers throttled down and presented numbers. The offense became more collaborative. That's the wide receiver layer. It's not flashy, it's functional. The outside targets became rhythm stabilizers instead of just vertical threats. That allowed drives to stay alive. Third and medium no longer felt like a low-percentage bomb, it became a manageable conversion opportunity. There was also a change in how motion was used. Earlier, motion felt like a disguised tool, a way to confuse coverage. After the reset, motion became diagnostic. It forced defenses to declare man or zone, it created free releases, it protected receivers from press coverage at the line. That matters in today's NFL. Corners are physical, disrupt timing at the snap, and the entire concept collapses. By using stacked alignments and pre-snap shifts, Monken ensured his wideouts could get clean into their stems. That directly helped timing throws. And timing throws build quarterback confidence. The other major shift was in route combinations. Instead of isolating one receiver as the primary on deep concepts, plays began featuring high-low reads and layered progression concepts. That meant if the first read wasn't there, the second one was arriving in rhythm, not late. Receivers weren't just running vertical decoys, they were part of a progression structure. That builds accountability. When wideouts know they are integral to sustaining drives, not just generating highlights, their route discipline sharpens. Depth matters, break angles matter, body positioning at the catch point matters. And you could see that sharpening. Receivers were attacking leverage more deliberately, settling into soft spots against zone, fighting for inside positioning against man. There was less freelancing, more precision. Even blocking assignments became more intentional. With quicker throws and perimeter concepts, wide receivers had to seal edges and finish plays. That physical buy-in reinforces offensive identity. It tells the locker room that everyone has a role beyond catching passes. The most underrated change, though, was tempo within routes. The offense stopped rushing vertical separation and started manipulating pace. Receivers varied stem speed. They sold vertical before breaking inside. They controlled defender hips instead of just outrunning them. That's veteran-level nuance. And when wide receivers operate with that kind of understanding, it simplifies life for everyone else. The quarterback sees defined windows, the offensive line protects for shorter durations, the play caller gains flexibility. That's why this layer matters. The reset wasn't loud, it wasn't a dramatic personnel change, it was structural refinement in how wide receivers fit into the system. Instead of stretching defenses recklessly, they began stressing them intelligently. An intelligent stress is harder to defend. Because when receivers are aligned with timing, spacing, and progression, the offense doesn't just look smoother. It becomes sustainable. This is where things really started to split. On one side, you had the national media conversation. On the other, you had fans rewinding clips, breaking down all 22 angles and comparing tendencies snap by snap. And the difference between those two worlds, it was massive. When headlines started forming, the early narrative was simple: confusion, miscommunication, lack of cohesion. Broad labels, broad blame. It's the easiest way to frame a storyline, reduce complexity into something digestible. But football is never that simple. National coverage tends to move fast. A bad stretch becomes a trend. A single breakdown becomes systemic dysfunction. Analysts debate personalities, chemistry, leadership. That creates momentum, and once a narrative gains traction, it's hard to slow down. Yet fans were seeing something different. They weren't just reacting emotionally, they were isolating plays, counting protection schemes, tracking route timing, measuring snap-to-throw rhythm. What they discovered wasn't chaos, it was adjustment. And that's where the contrast sharpened. While mainstream commentary focused on surface-level friction, dedicated viewers noticed structural tweaks. The way formations shifted week to week, the change in motion frequency, the quicker route stems, the recalibrated protection calls. It didn't scream crisis, it whispered evolution. Part of the disconnect comes from how stories are built. Media outlets thrive on clarity. Conflict creates clarity. If something looks off, it's framed as disagreement. If execution falters, it becomes tension. That framing drives engagement. But football development often looks messy before it looks efficient. When Todd Monken began modifying concepts, tightening splits, reducing deep dropbacks, layering progressions differently, it wasn't flashy. It didn't create viral moments, it created incremental stability. Incremental stability doesn't dominate headlines. Fan investigators, however, live in the details. They noticed that third down efficiency improved before scoring did. They saw quarterback hits decrease slightly even before sack totals dropped. They tracked how early down play calling became more balanced. Those aren't narrative-friendly stats, but they matter. There's also a psychological layer here. Media discussions often frame things through personalities. Who's frustrated? Who's under pressure? Who's on the hot seat? That angle personalizes the story, making it easier for casual viewers to follow. Fan dissect structure. Was the pocket collapsing from the interior or the edge? Were receivers winning leverage at the break point? Did the back release late into protection? Those questions don't fit into a 30-second debate segment, but they reveal more truth. Another difference lies in time scale. Media reacts week to week. Fans studying film look month to month, and growth in football rarely happens in a single Sunday. The reset wasn't a sudden flip, it was layered. First came quicker concepts, then more diagnostic motion, then adjusted protection responsibilities, then refined route depth. Piece by piece, the offense reduced variance. Yet until explosive plays returned, the narrative lagged behind reality. That's the strange thing about perception. Efficiency isn't always visible. A well-executed 7-play drive doesn't trend, a sideline outburst does. But those steady drives, they're evidence of system alignment. There's also a financial and reputational component. Media ecosystems amplify stakes, contracts, expectations, draft positioning, all of it becomes part of the framing that heightens drama. Fans investigating tape strip it down to fundamentals. Is the quarterback hitting his back foot on rhythm? Are receivers settling into zone windows? Is the play caller sequencing effectively? Those answers exist on film, not in headlines. And when fans compared early season tape to later adjustments, they found fewer freelanced routes, tighter splits, and more defined progressions. That suggests coordination, not fracture. This isn't to say media analysis is useless. It shapes public conversation and highlights pressure points organizations must address, but it often operates at altitude. Fan investigation operates at ground level. And in this case, ground-level analysis painted a more patient picture. The offense wasn't imploding, it was recalibrating. When big plays returned, the narrative softened, but by then the structural work had already been underway for weeks. The headlines caught up to what film watchers already knew. That's the tension between narrative and investigation. One seeks clarity through storylines, the other seeks truth through detail. And in football, detail usually wins. Because while debates trend quickly, adjustments compound quietly. And the teams that survive scrutiny are often the ones making changes before the noise fades. In the end, the difference between perception and progress came down to patience. The media wanted answers immediately. The tape offered them gradually. This is where everything stops being theoretical. Because scheme tweaks and weekly adjustments are one thing, the draft is something else entirely. The draft is commitment, it's philosophy. It's the moment a franchise stops hedging and decides what it wants to be for the next 5 years. And that's why this section matters more than any other. When a team makes a move tied to the future, especially at quarterback, it isn't just selecting talent. It's selecting identity. It's deciding what kind of offense it wants to build, what kind of locker room it wants to shape, and how patient ownership is willing to be. The draft becomes a public declaration. And when conversations started centering around quarterback value and system alignment, the pressure intensified. Analysts debated traits, arm strength, pocket mobility, processing speed, leadership presence. Every throw became evidence, every flaw became amplified. But internally, the conversation is always different. Coaches don't just evaluate highlight reels, they evaluate fit. Can this quarterback operate timing concepts? Can he adjust protections? Can he manipulate safeties with his eyes? Can he recover after a mistake without forcing the next throw? Those questions determine whether a franchise is making a splash or making a foundation. This is where Shedeur Sanders entered the conversation in a serious way. Not as a viral personality, not as a headline generator. As a projection. His strengths aligned with rhythm-based concepts, accuracy in the short to intermediate game, willingness to operate within structure, confidence throwing from the pocket. Those traits matter more than pure arm talent in a system built on timing and spacing. But here's the risk. Drafting a quarterback isn't just about skill, it's about environment. If protection remains inconsistent, development stalls. If receiver chemistry lags, progress slows. If play calling shifts weekly, confidence erodes. A franchise bet only works if the ecosystem supports it. That's why the draft conversation was bigger than one name. It was about whether the organization was ready to commit to a clear offensive identity. Was it going to lean into quick game efficiency, play-action balance, structured progression reads? Or would it chase explosive variance again? Every draft pick signals philosophy. If you invest high capital in a quarterback who thrives on rhythm, you're saying you believe in structure. If you prioritize offensive line depth, you're saying protection stability matters. If you stack wide receivers with route precision, you're reinforcing timing principles. The draft board becomes a blueprint. And fans understood that. They weren't just debating stats, they were debating trajectory. Was the team building sustainably or just reacting to noise? There's also a financial reality. Rookie quarterback contracts create a window. If you hit on the pick, you gain roster flexibility. You can invest in defense, skill positions, depth, miss on the pick, and you reset the clock again. That's why it's called a franchise bet. Because you're wagering not just on talent, but on alignment between coaching vision and player development. The pressure compounds quickly. The moment a quarterback is drafted high, expectations inflate. Early struggles become referendum debates. Media cycles demand immediate return. Patience becomes fragile. But historically, the teams that succeed are the ones that protect development timelines. They simplify early reads. They design confidence throws. They build around strengths rather than forcing a prospect into rigidity. That's the unseen part of the draft decision. It's not draft night applause, it's year one scaffolding. And if the offensive reset we've been discussing is real, quicker concepts, smarter spacing, refined protection, then the infrastructure is forming at the right time. Because drafting into chaos is dangerous. Drafting into clarity is powerful. The franchise bet isn't about winning week one. It's about being competitive in year three. It's about building something resilient enough to survive injuries, adversity, and defensive adjustments. So when the draft became central to the conversation, it wasn't hype, it was inevitability. You can tweak a system, you can patch protection, you can adjust play calling. But eventually, you decide who the system belongs to. That's the draft. That's the bet. And once it's made, there's no hedging, only development, patience, and execution. Because in the NFL, the future isn't promised. It's selected. This is the question that fueled everything. Was it sabotage? Or was it structural collapse? Because when an offense stalls, when communication looks fractured, when execution dips at critical moments, fans don't default to normal growing pains. They default to suspicion. Sabotage is dramatic, it's intentional. It implies internal conflict, ego clashes, hidden agendas. Structural collapse is different, it's slower, it's systemic. It's the result of misalignment, not malice. And the truth usually lives in the uncomfortable space between those two extremes. Let's start with sabotage. For sabotage to exist in a football context, you need intent. Intent to undermine, intent to miscommunicate, intent to expose flaws. That's a heavy accusation. NFL locker rooms are competitive, but they are also professional ecosystems built on incentives. Players' contracts, coaches' reputations, future job opportunities, all of it depends on performance. Intentionally tanking your own system doesn't just hurt one person, it hurts everyone involved. That makes sabotage emotionally compelling, but logically fragile. Now consider structural collapse. Offensive systems are interconnected machines. Quarterback timing is tied to protection. Protection is tied to communication. Route depth is tied to quarterback footwork. Play calling is tied to trust. When one piece drifts slightly off rhythm, the ripple effect spreads. A half-second delay in protection adjustment leads to hurried throws. Hurried throws create missed windows create stalled drives create frustration creates visible sideline tension. From the outside, that tension looks personal. From the inside, it's usually mechanical. When observers began dissecting the tape, they noticed something important. The breakdowns weren't chaotic, they were patterned. Protection slides were occasionally late, route timing occasionally mismatched the quarterback's drop, the spacing of certain concepts compressed under pressure. Those are structural stress indicators, not acts of sabotage. And when Todd Monken adjusted the system, tightening splits, leaning into quicker reads, sequencing safer early down concepts, the offense didn't explode overnight. It stabilized gradually. Sabotage doesn't fix itself through minor structural refinements. Systems do. There's also the psychological layer. When a franchise transitions phases, whether through quarterback development, schematic shifts, or personnel changes, there is always friction. Timing must recalibrate, trust must rebuild, confidence must reset. In that recalibration window, mistakes look louder than they are. And when a high-profile quarterback prospect like Shedeur becomes part of the broader conversation about the future, scrutiny intensifies. Every flaw becomes magnified. Every stalled drive feels symbolic. But symbolism isn't always reality. Football is violent precision, 11 moving parts executing in under 3 seconds. If just one element hesitates, the entire play collapses visually, even if the system itself remains sound. Structural collapse happens when small misalignments stack without correction. But here, the key distinction: collapse continues downward. What we saw instead was recalibration. Third down efficiency ticked upward before explosive plays returned. Protection communication improved before highlight throws resurfaced. Sequencing became more balanced before scoring totals climbed. Those are signs of structural repair. Sabotage leaves scars, structural issues leave lessons. And lessons can be applied. The media narrative leaned toward drama because drama drives engagement. Fans leaned toward suspicion because suspicion feels protective, especially when expectations are high. But film rarely lies. The film showed adjustment. It showed refinement. It showed a system correcting itself, not imploding from within. Was there frustration? Absolutely. Was there miscommunication? At times. Was there ego tension? In any competitive environment? Yes. But sabotage requires intent to harm. Structural strain requires misalignment under pressure. One implies conspiracy. The other implies complexity. And complexity is far more common in professional sports than conspiracy. In the end, the question wasn't whether someone tried to undermine the system. The question was whether the system was strong enough to withstand stress. And over time, the evidence suggested it was. Because collapse spirals, adjustment stabilizes. And what looked like sabotage from the outside ultimately resembled a franchise navigating structural tension in real time, imperfectly, publicly, but progressively. So no, it wasn't sabotage. It was a system under pressure, recalibrating in front of everyone. And sometimes, the most dramatic narratives dissolve when you slow the tape down and watch carefully. Because football doesn't reward conspiracy. It rewards correction.